We are live. Hey guys, hey Top100 Startups, welcome, and other viewers, welcome to the AMA with Steve. Steve is the founder and co-founder and current vice chairman of PropertyGuru. And in the early years of PropertyGuru, he undertook a really ambitious expansion of PropertyGuru from just Singapore to many more countries that really cemented PropertyGuru's success today. And today he'll be sharing on his experiences with scaling a startup, about specifically covering the topic how to scale and sort of when to scale and what you should sort of think about when you want to do scaling. So,
hi guys. So how do you want to run this then, Ivan?
So maybe you could share a bit more about your experience with the scaling in terms of like on a very like how was it firsthand, running it, leading it, and experiencing on a day-to-day basis. Scaling.
Yeah, sure. So hi everybody. I'm really happy to be here and sharing, I guess, my experiences and my battle scars from doing the managing the whole scaling process in PropertyGuru over the last sort of 10 years ago, and it's been a great journey. But so I'm one of the founders. We started off in Singapore. We focused just on Singapore for the first about 4.5 years. We built Singapore into a profitable business and a high-growing company. And then 2011 felt that, okay, we had roughly a sort of 80% market share of all the people looking for property in Singapore and build a strong business here. And we thought, okay, let's just now copy and paste this and roll it out across Southeast Asia. And that was wrong. That wasn't exactly what happened. And I'm happy sharing some of my experiences of doing that. But we basically went from 1 country to 4 countries in 4 months. And that put enormous pressure and strain and almost broke the company over a period of 1 or 2 years. And I'll share a little bit more about that if anyone's interested in terms of some of the specific learnings from that and mistakes we made. And as a result, the lessons we learned. And then really for the last 4 or 5 years, we've been, we underestimated how tough it would be to do international outside of Singapore, going from 1 market and 1 structure for organization to multi-region, regional business with all the challenges of each individual country. But then over the last sort of 2 or 3 years, we focus a lot more around professionalizing the organization in terms of putting more process and systems in place, building the executive leadership team and the middle management team, and really bringing on board some high quality investors. So kind of 3 phases, or 4 phases. One was a bootstrap, prove the concept, build a strong Singapore business. Then we internationalized. And then more recently, it's been a bit more focused around professionalizing and scaling the business. I'm really happy to be here and share, my experiences. I obviously can't tell you, how to run your business, how to build your business, but I can certainly share my experiences in terms of how we did it and what mistakes and lessons we learned. And anything from, building the team to building the culture, to finance, to organizational structures and this kind of thing. So really happy sharing, and I'm really happy to take any questions you may have.
All right, cool. So thanks so much for the introduction, Steve. And today for the AMA, we'll be taking questions in article first, before moving on to the YouTube live questions.
Sure.
So I think our first question is from Ashley. So from Ashley, he says the first mistake that many founders make is beginning to scale the startup too soon. And some founders try to scale with errors still present in the product, believing that the kinks will work themselves out over time. Do you agree with this, and how would you do it differently?
Yeah, I think well, there's 2 or 3 questions in there. So one is around scaling or internationalizing too early. I think, based on, my experience, quite often when I talk to startups and I do some angel investing and mentoring of some startups, quite often I hear pressure from investors to scale and internationalize very quickly. My experience has been, build a strong business and a core and a foundation first before trying to run too fast. And certainly that was the experience that we had, and I think it played out well, at least for us. The second element was around sort of product, and I think you can overanalyze and over-engineer and overbuild, and I think it's far more important just to get something out there. My experience in terms of building products and experimenting with new services and innovating. It's been the core DNA of the company, and we continue to do it, sometimes too much. Is that just make sure that you have the resources and commitment to follow through on the products and services you're building. Occasionally, for example, we've built products and services, we try to do too much at the same time, and therefore have half-hearted products. So I think getting out with an MVP and getting out there, get some experience and feedback from the customers, listen to the customers, and then tweak is the way to do it. Don't wait too long to have it the final product. But at the same time, don't try and do multiple things at the same time. Focus on the core that's addressing the real pain of the customer. So what's the big frustration? What's the big issue you're trying to solve? Focus on solving that one with the MVP.
Right. So you mentioned that startups should really look into building a strong foundation. So what are sort of the metrics, that they should say, like, this is the point where we build a strong enough foundation, let's scale? I mean, maybe you could share some of your experience with PropertyGuru's expansion too.
Yeah, sure. I guess it's going to be different for every business, because it's going to depend on the business model, it's going to depend on the market, it's going to depend on aspirations, it's going to depend on the competitive nature, etc. But at least in our case, the first stage for us was really just proving the concept. Could we build a product that, one, consumers wanted to use, and two, that advertisers, in our case, in the early days, agents would be willing to pay for? And so, we have a two-sided network model where the consumers use our services for free, and then the advertisers are paying. So we needed to build the demand side from the consumers and also supply side from the agents. But at the same time, we needed to get them to pay. So on day one, we had a paid business model, and that was really to test, to make sure that customers were willing to buy something. And if they were willing to buy something, it meant that they saw some value. And if they're willing to then continue to buy, then it would also mean that they're getting some value. So in our case, we had to prove the concept, and proving the concept was 12 months or so of a little bit of trial and error, a little bit of experimentation, but getting some traffic. And in our case, it was around about 200,000 people a month by the end of the first year, and some agents to pay for advertising, and that was about 1,000. So by the end of the first year, we had 1,000 agents paying a very small amount of money, which is the case, $50 each, to pay to advertise their listings, and the leads they were generating were resulting in transactions, and they were generating commission from that and making a nice income from that. So we kind of proved the model, and from there we then started to invest a little bit more heavily and use this as a way of getting our first investment round.
Right. So basically what you're saying is that startups should basically look to test their proof of concept, and once they've sort of gotten a basic some sort of traction, they should immediately sort of look to sort of like scale and how they can expand on what they're doing, in a sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was our experience, so we wanted to make sure that the business model worked, and that there was interest in it. And by growing both on the consumer side and also in our case the agent side, and getting them willingness to buy and pay for something, albeit $50, it demonstrated that there was a business model that could be built from that. Now, obviously, if that hadn't worked, then we would have had to try and tweak and look for different ways of generating revenue or generating the traction from the consumers. Yeah, that was our case, and I guess we continued then to provide additional value and tools to the agent, so that the service that they were getting, was felt valued. So in other words, we gave them free websites, we gave them Facebook access, we started to build mobile apps for them, and this kind of thing. So we started to build on that. But the core product really was pay some money to advertise to get some leads.
I see. So moving on to the next question. So we have a question from Jared. So Jared asks, I understand that there will never be a right time to scale your business, but at what period of time do you think would be right, and should you trust your gut feel?
I think in many cases, founders know their business better than anybody else, and that's why I always encourage founders and businesses not to be pushed by the investors necessary to expand before they're ready. At the same time, you need to be ready. So I think gut is important, but for us, it was really around, have we built a solid foundation? Have we tweaked and ironed out some of the kinks? Have we got the basics right? Do we think that actually, if we go from, the first year to the second year, we can increase the number of consumers, we can increase the number of agents. So in our case, what we did was we bootstrapped the business first of all. We put $300,000 into the business, and that lasted the company for the first 18 months. And of course, we weren't taking a salary or anything like that, but and we tried to show that the business model was working. So by the end of the first year, we had that 1,000 agents, paying a little bit of money, and also consumers using the service. And then we used that as a vehicle to go out and then raise the next round to support the scaling on and increasing the strength of the Singapore business. So we then raised $1.2 million at the end of 2008, and that then was the money required for the next 2 to 3 years of building out the Singapore business into a strong position. So by the end of the first 4 years or so, 4.5 years, we had a strong business which had gone cash flow positive and then profitable, and we felt that stage was a time to really start to scale. And for us, that meant either going into jobs, cars, travel, etc., all other kinds of digital verticals in Singapore, or it meant expanding internationally. And we felt that we had built a strength in our domain, which was the real estate space, and therefore decided to expand internationally. So that was at that right time when we had, of all the people looking in Singapore, close to 80% of people looking were using PropertyGuru, and we had by that stage about 10,000 agents paying to use our services. It had gone from cash flow positive to profitable, and so we then had quite lengthy discussions with our investors and said, well, maybe now's the time to expand. Up until that point, we had resisted it, because we wanted to build that solid foundation. I know other companies which have gone, on day one, very, very broad, and certainly B2B businesses, it's a little bit easier to do that because typically you've got a generic model, which is maybe sector specific, which you can then roll out across multiple countries. In our case, we were going to effectively build a version of PropertyGuru Singapore in each of the markets. So it required a little bit more thought process and investment in each market to customize.
Just want to sort of take this point a bit further, because I feel like scaling is like any other decision, is sort of a way to manage risk. So I was just curious, like in PropertyGuru, what sort of like methods do you use to sort of evaluate your decisions? Is it like by like debate, discussion, more top down? Like how is it in the early stages? So just
in the early stages, it was, I'm sure for many startups, it is a little bit around experimentation. It's a little bit around gut. It's, it's talking to customers, listening to customers. And I guess the challenge of that is that if you have enough discussions with customers, each of them will tell you something completely different. And then suddenly you're presented with, 20 different business lines you can start to explore. And I guess in the early days, particularly, what we did was we tried to pursue all of those all at the same time and see what sticks. So was there a well-articulated, analyzed decision-making process for each of the things we did? No. Was it around intuition, feedback, a little bit of guesstimates, a little bit of rough calculations? Yes. I would say that today, so we think about all the experiments that we've run. Some of those have worked well, some of them haven't, and some of them have been, very specific aim in mind. So for example, we launched a print product. It's very strange for an online company to launch a print product, right? But we realized actually some of our clients were still not quite ready to go online. So how do we start to build a relationship and build some revenue from them? Well, they were all advertising in print, so let's have a print product. But let's say that it's going to maybe last 4 or 5 years, and so the intention was just to build that. And that's actually worked quite well because our first customer was one of the largest developers in Singapore, and they had not advertised at all previously to that. Then they bought the front page of this newspaper from us. So that was a bit strange. That one worked, but we had some experiments where it didn't really work. We launched a property analytics service just because we felt but by providing transparency. There was not much transparency in the market, so property data and analytics would be a really good thing to have. And in 2009, I think it was, we launched a property analytics service, and it worked well, but it was far too complicated, and also we were doing far too many other things at that stage, and therefore we didn't really follow through on an investment on it. So when it came to the following year, yes, we had a half-baked product, MVP. It really required a bit more investment, but then we had 5 or 6 other things we were working on, so that got less and less attention, and then of course naturally it didn't perform that well, and we ended up mothballing it probably 3 or 4 years later. We have a similar product with something called Smart Select, which great idea, completely innovative new way of searching for property, basically scoring various properties based on your interests. Very innovative. Hadn't been done anywhere before. However, we just didn't execute on it for similar sort of reasons. Ironically, now we're doing something similar, but it's at the time we didn't resource it properly. So yeah, I'm not sure why I was saying all of that, but just sharing a little bit. Oh yeah, so in terms of how we do new things and analyze things. So some of that's been around, gut and instinct and talking and listening to customers, and some of it's been around, sort of researching the market. I think as we've got a little bit more mature and as we've sort of scaled the business, what we do now is when we do experimentations and start to look at new business lines and new ideas, we do a little bit more well thought through process and do a little bit more analysis around the market. We do a little bit more thought process around one particular experiment at a time. So we're not trying to do 10 things at the same time. As we say, like, okay, maybe we want to do something in one part of our market, which will be across one sector across all 5 countries. Then we'll choose that one rather than trying to do 4 or 5 different ones at the same time, if that makes sense.
So it's basically just a lot more focus on one particular topic now, like rather than trying to get it done well. Yeah,
exactly. So that's a key difference now versus before. Before it was a little bit more gut and trying to do too much, which invariably leads to less things happening. But I think in the early stages of building a business, you need to learn, you need to experiment and do things really rapidly. And if it's not working, kill it and then do something else. And I think that fast iteration and innovation and failure piece is really, really important. Just my own lesson learned has been, if you do want to do an experiment, you need to be able to commit to put some resources behind it, because if you're running a core business and you've got lots of other things next to it, they may actually have a big opportunity behind them, but unless you're willing to devote a bit of resource to it, it won't happen. So that's been a kind of a lesson I've personally learned in terms of trying to do too much as an entrepreneur. And it's in my DNA. I love doing new things, but I've also learned a little bit to prioritize and focus a bit more, because do 2 or 3 things really, really well rather than 20 things really badly.
So when do you guys maybe like have a new initiative, right? So when do you decide to maybe like kill it? Because I know when people are maybe like scaling, they try a lot of new ideas, right? Like, can I scale my business by doing X or Y? And a lot of time after you invested a lot of time in it, it becomes very tough to sort of make the decision and say, let's stop doing this, right? So when do you guys, in maybe your example, your experience, when do you guys do something?
Yeah, so in the case of the property analytics business, for example, we spent a lot of time analyzing and saying, how can we actually do something with this business? And we, in the end, we said, are we willing to really put a lot of resource into this versus doing X, Y, and Z? And we said, well, what's more important? Well, actually, X, Y, and Z is more important, and therefore we took the reluctant decision to mothball that product. In the case of our loan business, for example, so we launched an online mortgage brokerage in 2009, and it was very successful for about 3 years, and we learned a lot, and we generated a lot of revenue from this. And then what happened was that the referral fees from the bank dropped effectively 75%. The transaction volumes in terms of new mortgages dropped by about 50%. So we had about 95% drop in revenue. And we had a team of about 15 people focused on this business. It very quickly became very loss-making. So we tried a couple of pivots and iterations of the business, and then ended up reluctantly shutting that business down purely for financial reasons. It was just no longer financially viable. So that was a little bit easier, a little bit more clean cut. The property analytics one was a little bit harder because there's a bit of emotion attached to it, as was the loan business. But it was you didn't really know whether it had true potential or not, whether it would do something or not. Whereas the loan business, we saw that it had potential, but clearly external factors meant that we couldn't make a viable business out of it anymore.
Right. So if you could maybe like go back to when you had maybe like 20 ideas, right? You were at the start. So how would you like approach it differently now?
I guess the key lesson for me from all of that would be not trying to do too much at the same time. So it being a little bit more focused around what's the core pain you are trying to solve. In our case, what our core pain was trying to make the market more transparent to help consumers make better decisions. So focused around the consumer. And focused around their property journey. But then you start to think maybe around, how does a print product help that? Well, maybe it doesn't. It's more around generating revenue. How does our loan business help? Yeah, it's interesting, it's important, but it's actually not fixing the core. So you start to think about, just focusing around that core proposition. So I guess the key lesson would be, one, focus on around the real pain you're addressing. Two, don't try and do too much, because if you do too much, you can distract yourselves from the core problem you're trying to solve. And I think, so now, and also the last lesson would be, if you are going to do an experiment, also think about, what resources you may need to commit to then continue to then scale and grow that experiment or opportunity for the future. Because all businesses and startups, we have limited resources and only so much you can do, and so you have to think, if I'm not working on my core and I'm working on 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 experiments, then there's an opportunity cost. I'm not addressing the real problem. So a bit more focus, and then also don't try and do too many, and make sure you allocate some resources for building on that experiment.
So I'm just going to move on to the next question with Yahweh. So Yahweh asks, if your competitors aggressively expanding together with my startup, so for example, I think it's like eating into your market share. So what are some ways you can maybe differentiate yourself from them and survive this like hostile scaling of your competitor?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at my own experiences in this, we've now been around for about 10 years, and every single year, we've had new competitors coming in and then some going, and new competitors coming in and some going. And, so if I reflect a little bit on what we've done, or what we've tried to do at least, is don't get too hung up on the competitors. It's very easy to get distracted and, start being obsessed by the things that your competitor's doing. The trick, at least in my experience, is to focus on your own business, focus on the problem you're trying to fix, focus on your own customers, and continual innovation around that customer problem. What are you doing to solve that customer problem? I think it's have a little bit of healthy paranoia, and don't completely ignore your competitors, because clearly, if you did that, then you'd be stupid, because you might get bitten at some point. But don't get absolutely obsessed by it either. Don't get scared by it either. I mean, I remember probably about 3 or 4 years ago, our core market in those days was Singapore, and we just started to expand into Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. We were spending a lot of focus on those markets, and as a result, we probably lost focus a little bit on Singapore. At the same time, the largest traditional competitors, in other words, the newspaper company, was very, very aggressively investing in its digital business. It just launched a rebranded property vertical in Singapore, and it was investing 10 times our marketing dollars in Singapore. Everywhere you went, on the bus, every single bus effectively had their brand on it. Every taxi in Singapore had their brand on it. Every newspaper, issue had 2, 3, 4 pages of their brand in it. And so it was a real onslaught. And we all got very worried, and our board got very worried, and suddenly, there was a lot of conversations around how do we defend against this. And then if you fast forward, 18 months later, nothing really had materially changed in terms of our market share. We just carried on focusing on our own business, and didn't get too worried about what they were doing, and focused more on what we could do. But it was a particularly challenging time because we'd gone from that one country to 4 countries, and completely and utterly underestimated the challenges of that, and that was really tough. And at the same time, of course, facing this additional competitive pressure in our core market.
Because it's like so there's something I read a while back. It's this idea of a blue ocean strategy. And so the whole thesis behind it is that instead of trying to compete with your competitors, you should create your own category. Because if you create your own category, you win.
Yes.
If you fight in your original category with all your competitors, it's sort of like a red ocean that's full of blood. And it sounds very similar to what you're saying. Just the idea of focusing on your core competency and the need that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the case of blue ocean versus red ocean, that's very much around creating a brand new market that doesn't already exist. And effectively, then you start to create customer need around that new market. In our case, we effectively did that by being, almost first mover. And we have, up until 2007, 2008, the market was, if you want to look for property, you wade through 50 pages of newspaper, 3 lines of text. And we then created the market, which was actually bringing all of the property information, articles, research, transactions, videos, floor plans, all online, and helping them people make the decision. And that was effectively our blue ocean strategy. And then, of course, other competitors then will come into your blue ocean and try to compete. And of course, it gets a bit red at sometimes. Yeah, for us, it was around continual innovation. Just keep focused on what's the problem we're solving. The problem we're trying to solve is helping the consumer find their property and help them make a better decision around their property. And that's just what we just kept focused on.
So in terms of a startup that's looking maybe like more long term, right?
Yeah.
So apart from just focusing on your niche, how should they maybe like position their brand for like a more long term thing? Because it feels like it feels kind of like related in this to me, which is how can you build a more long term brand?
I'm not sure if so what's the question? Is it brand branding or what? I didn't quite understand. I'm sorry.
So one way that we were talking about was the idea of focusing on the core niche, right? And
yes.
Another thing that I sort of just occurred to me was another way to do it might be just through brand, whereby you strengthen like your relationship maybe with the consumer so that they trust you more.
Yes.
So how would you maybe like suggest, maybe if you had like pivoted towards this decision instead to go for brand instead of core competency, like how would you maybe have done it?
I don't think you can separate the two. I think the brand is associated with the service and what the customer's getting. So in our case, what that means is you focus on a great product. Yes, you can go and buy. In our case, go and buy traffic. But that's a very transactional. Once you switch it off, it goes away again. So we look at brand and brand preference as a leading indicator to how the rest of the business is doing. So one of our key metrics, for example, because we're an online business, is what's our brand query index. So are people, what percentage of the market is typing PropertyGuru into the search box on Google as one measure, for example, of brand preference. So if I look at, for example, Malaysia, when we 1 year after entering the market, we had a 5% brand query index, and now we have a 43% brand query index, which means that 43% of people looking for real estate in Malaysia are now typing PropertyGuru into the search box versus 2012. So we look at some brand measures to understand, are customers thinking about us? Are they, do they have awareness? Do they have preference for our brand versus other brands? But ultimately, why have they got a preference? And I believe that the reason why they have preference is because we're focused on solving the problem, which is around the technology and the products and service to help the customer. So in our case, is it can they find a property easily? Can we help them make a decision? Are they become more informed? So that means, the content that we provide, the guidance, the tools we provide, the services we provide, which ultimately will shape their preference and therefore, hopefully, the brand preference for PropertyGuru. So I don't think you can isolate the two, but we don't think brand on its own. We think the brand is a component of the service.
So Kevin has a question about scaling. So what happens when I'm scaling and I lose a key employee? So That's his question. So how would you maybe deal with that, or have you had any experience with that?
Yeah, that's I think when I reflect a little bit on scaling and the last 10 years, the biggest challenge that we have faced from day one and until today is around talent, and I think it'll probably be the same for most businesses. When I rewind back to 10 years ago, we had no brand, no money, no credibility, no office was horrible, little Chinatown, horrible garage with power cuts every 2 hours, wires everywhere, air conditioning breaking all the time. It was very hard to convince people to join. So naturally, you then have to compromise a little bit on maybe some of the skills, the capabilities, experience, and maybe a little bit on culture and values. If I'm honest, so despite the fact we say, look, this is our, we'll only hire people who are true to our culture and values. It's very hard. Later on, it's been around, well, suddenly there's lots of competition. Everyone's trying to hire digital experience, and the war on talent is very high. So even now we have a brand, now we have, a well-established business, a large team, and etc. It's still hard. We have to pay a lot more and to get really experienced people because everyone's fighting for the same resource. In the early days, when you're scaling and you're a small business, you rely heavily on a small number of people. So if one of those people goes, it's a big impact on the business. And I'll give you one example that I faced, and it's very painfully etched onto my brain. It's mentally scarred me, which was about 4 years into the business. Our two top sales guys had about 80% of all of the revenue. They were responsible for 80% of it. They worked 7 days a week. They were working 14-hour days, constantly on call, constantly working with the customers, working incredibly hard, earning a huge amount of money because we gave them a very generous commission package. So one day they came along and said, by the way, we're going to resign unless you double our salary. And this was a very tough decision because I hated that. I hated the fact that I was being held to ransom by these two guys, one of which had been with the business since day one, who I thought was a personal friend, and like I said, had a whole bunch of emotions, conflicting emotions around this whole thing, and it went contrary completely to our core culture and values. And I compromised that by saying, one of you go, one of you stay, and we will give you what you want. And then what we did was we basically hired around this guy and reduced the dependency on this one guy. But it was, I had sleepless nights for a while because I had this vision of 80% of my revenue walking out the door with these two guys. So you built this business after 4 years, and suddenly, two guys come along and say, we're going to take all the business away because we're so reliant on those people. So when you're small and a startup, you don't have the processes and systems in place necessarily. You rely on individuals, and you become very reliant on certain individuals. In our case, those two sales guys, as an example. And when one or both decide to go, then suddenly you're in a real tough position. And at that stage, it felt like not the end of the world, but it felt pretty close to it to me, because we start to think a little bit about the next round of fundraising, etc. And if you just talk about 80% of the revenue walking out the door, that's pretty scary. So it's tough when you're small to scale and with people who might then want to leave. At the same time, when we did scale, we hired almost 200 people and very quickly lost 200 people because we didn't really do a good job of scaling the company from one country to 4 countries.
Right. So in terms of like making the difference between personal and professional, I suppose, because you mentioned that this person was a personal friend to you at this point in time. Because I think many startup founders, when they do the startup, a lot of the employees become close friends. So when it comes to like strong decisions, how do you like separate the personal from the private? How do you try to at least?
That's a really hard question. To be honest, I think in the early days, the first 5 or 6 years, there was no difference between personal and private. My life was the company, and I was spending 7 days a week in the business, and everything I was doing was around the business. And so my social life, my friends, was all around the people in the company, so it was very hard to separate the two, to be honest. but clearly, as a founder, maybe your motivations are different than someone who's an employee. And so that came as like a rude shock in this case, So I understand it because obviously people want to get the best they can for themselves and their family, and so I can understand why people make their decisions up for career or for monetary reasons. But yeah, it's hard, and it's very, I mean, depending on your personality. For me, I always found it, I always took it a little bit personally because I wanted to build this family culture, and I wanted people who are contributing to the business to stay with the business. But of course, in reality, people's own lives and career objectives will change over time. So some people start to leave, and I guess I've got a little bit more hardened to that, and I guess recognize that a lot more. In the early days, it was a lot harder, particularly when you're reliant on a small number of people.
I see. Because it sounds really sort of similar to what I've read some time back. I can't remember who said it, but it says like when you're doing a startup, when the next employee comes in, it should be a question of why. It should always be thinking about how this person sort of fits in. Like, do they really believe in the beliefs? Like, sort of, how do I phrase it?
Yeah, I think
that's aligned with the values of your startup.
Of course, and we have a very strict process which says, look, we hire based on attitude and fit to the culture and the values. However, saying that, no matter how many interviews you do, whether you do pre-screening, you do individual interviews, you do panel sessions, you make a decision based on those rounds of interviews and based on background feedback from friends, from other people they work with, and you make a decision on that. And it's not always right. We've had someone paying bribes to get payments from banks. We've had someone siphoning marketing budget to their wife's company. We've had a alcoholic country manager, a whole bunch of people, which at the time you made a decision based on the interview process, but actually fast forward a little bit later, you realize actually perhaps they weren't the people that you thought they were. And it's very hard to mitigate against that. The one thing I would say, though, in my experience, has been that once you start to get a feeling about it, your gut is almost always right. So whether it's right at the first interview or whether it's later on, once I've been with a company, 99% of the time, the gut is right. So even if you say, look, this person's not quite working out, let's give them a second chance. Let's sit down with them. Let's explain why they're not fitting in from a cultural or values point of view. The 99% of the time, it still doesn't work. And so your gut, in my experience, is normally right. And it got so many experiences over the last 10 years. So yeah, follow your gut, I think, when it comes to hiring and people management.
So has there been a case where like this guy like fails all the normal like criteria, like his background's maybe a bit off, like maybe he doesn't have the right skill set, but your gut's like yes, and you took a chance on him and it paid off like really well? Has there been like a really strong case, like, memorable case of something like this happen?
Yeah, we've taken risks on people who have come from very, very odd backgrounds and not from experience and skill set point of view don't look right, but have had a fantastic attitude. If they've got positivity, can do, want to make a difference, believe in the vision and the cause and the values, I would hire that person a drop of a hat versus someone who's got deep domain expertise and functional expertise, because they're more likely to be able to grow with the company and adapt to a fast-growing organization. Because when you hire somebody in a startup, and if the startup's growing, the chances are that person will not be doing the same job that they are today in 18 months' time. They're going to be doing something completely different because the organization's changed, it's grown. They might be managing teams, they might be doing a completely different job. And if they are quite rigid in their expertise and focus and domain, they might not be quite not so flexible or so resilient to be able to manage that change and move around in the organization. So the people who've done really well in PropertyGuru have been people who have had that fantastic attitude and energy and can do, and have moved around the organization from function to function, upwards and sideways, and done all sorts of different roles. Those are the guys who've done really, really well in the organization. And it's less around functional expertise, more around attitude.
I feel like it's very like this. I think the best way to sort of put it is like you can buy a lot of things, but you can't buy someone's heart. So if like their heart is really like aligned with your values and they have the right like mindset, I think it makes a lot more sense to get them on board as compared to someone who has the right skills for that moment.
Yeah, I'd agree.
I'd agree. Right now, 18 months down the road, sort of. Yeah. So I think the next question from Tracy. So investors are always saying that they're interested in scalable startups. So what are the common criteria that investors normally look at to determine like the scalability of a startup?
Yeah, I think if I look at my own experiences raising money in PropertyGuru, and I look at my own experiences of investing in companies, I think the scalability piece is really important, because the scalability piece means that it can become nicely profitable. It means it can it can grow fast rather than having to hire X to grow X. I would agree with that. I think for us, I think demonstrating that a business can scale is obviously one way of convincing the investors. Demonstrating that there is a big pain, so big customer pain that can be addressed in a profitable way. So in our case, if I look at similar businesses around the world, they're generating anywhere between 40 to 60% net profit, very, very cash generative businesses. So the kind of business model kind of translates across multiple markets. And what we needed to do to demonstrate the scalability of PropertyGuru was to show that we could roll this out across multiple markets, which of course we did. But took longer than we wanted it to. What can you show that you grow revenue by X without having to grow your cost by the same amount? So in our case, the business is heavily fixed costs, less around variables. So once you've covered your fixed costs, then you start to get very strong profitability in the business. So it's obviously a very scalable business in that case. Whereas if you are having to grow revenue and your costs have to grow and equal to it, then it's less scalable. I'm not sure if that really answers the question. I think in terms of what investors look for, I think scalability is obviously the one area, but it's also about are you in a big growing market? Are you solving a big pain? Do you have a strong team? Are you demonstrating some traction? So you've demonstrated that on day one you were here, and then in the future you're here, and the train is leaving the station. You think things are moving. So investors should get on board now, otherwise they miss the opportunity. Yeah.
I think that sort of addresses the issue, like kind of addresses Tracy's question. The idea that you should try to prove like you have a working model, or that you can sort of like break down your cost to show that even if you scale in the future, like the profit is gonna stay there. I think that's basically like sort of what she's asking about in a sense.
Yeah, exactly right. So if you can demonstrate that your business from a financial point of view can scale. So in other words, as I said, the revenue will grow significantly faster than the cost at a certain point in the so there is a path to profitability, and actually that profitability is strong when you reach a certain point. Then the business shows it can be scalable. But typically, if you look at it as Series A or Series B, that might not be the case. You might not be profitable yet, but can you show that there is a path to profit? Because ultimately, the investors are going to want to see that the business can become profitable at some stage to support an exit or future investment. So, yeah, I guess that'd be the way I'd look at it.
Okay, so just moving on to the next question. So Yon has a question. He says, how do you balance maybe scaling and generating profits?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, how do I answer that? Again, I think it depends a little bit on what the business model is. So, for example, if you are building a B2B business, then typically you are looking at addressing a particular sector, maybe on a multiple geography point of view, and therefore you need to be able to demonstrate that you can scalably grow the revenues quickly without having to grow the costs. And therefore, probably the path to profitability can be, in many cases, faster. It becomes cash flow faster because you're generating a revenue from a business customer. In the case of a consumer business, it's a bit more challenging because in many cases you are trying to acquire consumers at a lower cost than generating revenue from those consumers, and also doing that in a sustainable way. So in our case, what do we look at? We look at, what are some of the quality traffic measures. So if we switch off all of our paid advertising for traffic, for example, on the consumer business, do we still then get people coming to our website because it's a brand, or are they still actually downloading our apps? Are they using our apps? So what's the quality traffic score? So when we look at a consumer business, we look at the quality traffic, which is direct traffic, SEO traffic, and app traffic, and look at what kind of percentage of that traffic is unpaid versus paid. And so typically what happens is, in a strong market where you have strong brand preference and a strong product and a strong reach, you're less reliant on paid traffic. So in the case of our business, in Singapore, we don't rely much on paid traffic because people are coming to the site and using the app. In other markets, which are still more emerging, we're still a bit closer to 40% of our traffic is coming from paid. And so we're still investing heavily in still building the traffic and trying to build the brand around that. I think at some point, though, you still need to show that you can get to profitability. And if it's an existing business model which has been used around the world, which you're building around Asia, for example, then it might be a little bit easier to say, look, we're building a similar sort of business. If you show a similar trajectory in terms of the core KPIs for that sector, then I guess you can show that the business can become profitable. If it's something completely new, it's a bit more challenging. So I guess some of the rideshare companies are looking at this at the moment. And at what point will they become profitable if the revenue's growing like this and the losses are going down like this? At what point do you start to show profit? And I guess you show profit once you have a dominant position or a clear market position, and no longer need to subsidize businesses. But I guess that's still early on in that process for that sector, I guess.
So just curious. So you mentioned B2B businesses and B2C business.
Yeah.
So if PropertyGuru had been maybe a B2B business, would you guys have maybe attempted such a maybe aggressive expansion, or would you have been a bit more conservative?
We would probably focus more on generating profitable revenue earlier on. So to show that show that the business model works earlier on. So I think yes, we would. The expectation also of investors is that a B2B business would become profitable sooner rather than later.
All right, so let's move on to the next question from Jolene. So Jolene asks, what's the biggest challenge that you faced when you started scaling? I think the biggest challenge, well, I mentioned already talent and on hiring and how challenging that's been throughout the journey of PropertyGuru and continues to be, because there's just more and more competition for talent. I think if I reflect on the journey of the last 10 years, the biggest challenge that we faced was when we expanded aggressively from 1 market to 4 markets in 4 months. We assumed that we'd be able to replicate our Singapore business in all the other markets, which is a little bit naive, probably in retrospect. When we went out and so if you think about it at that stage, and this is something which is really important, I think, for businesses thinking about internationalizing. At that stage, the whole of our organization was a Singapore organization. Finance team focused on Singapore, HR team focused on Singapore, the product team focused on Singapore, tech team focused on Singapore, sales and marketing all focused on Singapore. A single country organizational structure. We went from that to saying now, product and IT team, we want you to build websites in additional 3 countries. We wanted to build 12 apps, iOS and Android, consumer and for agents. So 3 websites, 12 apps, roll that out. Sales and marketing team help us hire 200 people. HR team help us hire 200 people. Marketing team help us launch the brand in this market. And doing all of that at the same time, with an existing organization just focused on Singapore, almost broke the company. So pulled it to stretching point. So
The Singapore performance as a result suffered. Morale suffered because we were stretching people to breaking point. We went on a big hiring spree, you know, in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, hired close to 200 people, and those 200 people, those 200 gurus became ex-gurus very, very quickly because we weren't really onboarding them, we weren't training, we weren't supporting them. Purely from a product and tech point of view, we were naive in thinking that actually the product and technology can broadly be the same, but in reality, every market is very different. So how people look for property in Thailand is they look for neighborhoods, you know, Thong Lo, Sukhumvit, Siloam. In Singapore, they look for a condo name. So, you know, no longer are they looking at the condo database, they're actually looking for neighborhoods, they're looking for maps, they're looking for BTS stations on the map. And so the whole user interface had to change completely. We hadn't really thought through that. We also said, okay, let's keep the same software platform, so code base for Singapore, which we did on day one. But what then happened was that Malaysia had iterations, Thailand had iterations, Indonesia had iterations. So suddenly went from that one code base across 4 countries to suddenly 4 different code bases, all looking very, very different, which then we had to unpick later on and re-platform, which took almost 2 years. So we then, you know, we had to then go back and rebuild the platform for the whole, all the countries onto one platform again, for mobile and also for web. And that was a really tough process. We underestimated how hard it would be to build the teams in each of the countries. So every country, you know, has different issues in terms of hiring, in terms of the competitive landscape, in terms of culture, in terms of, you know, depth of talent. You know, so Indonesia, you know, in 2011, 12, there weren't that many people doing digital. And there still aren't that many people doing digital. It's better now than it was, but you know, it's very hard to find people. You know, we had to then resort to myself and my co-founder spending a lot of time in the markets. So pretty much 3-4 days a week, every week, in the markets, living, breathing, understanding what the issues were, talking to customers, talking to partners, talking to staff, and really getting to grips with that. That was an 18-month process of just doing that. So we were, as founders, we were spread very, very thin. Singapore suffered. The countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, took a lot longer to grow than we expected. It took a lot longer to grow, to build a, you know, strong presence in those markets. We thought 2 to 3 years we'll, you know, we have nice profitable businesses in each of those markets, and it's taken 6. We underestimated the complexities of going from 1 market to 4 markets. Suddenly, you know, the power of the complexity went up a factor of 10. We had to build a regional leadership team. We had to start to build middle management. We had to start putting more KPIs and business and processes in place. We had to put monthly business reviews in place, quarterly business reviews in place, getting all the teams working together. We experimented with different organizational structures. You know, so we went from saying, okay, the country manager is like a mini CEO, but we're not paying a mini CEO salary, we're paying a lower salary. And of course, therefore, there were not always maybe the caliber we wanted from a mini CEO, but there might have been a good general manager, or there might have been a good sales director, or there might have been a good marketing person. And so we then had to then evolve the organizational structure, because every country became doing things in its own way. So the brand was different, the pricing was different, the product was different, the priorities were different. There was no consistency between any of the countries, which therefore made scaling very hard. So then what we did is we changed the organization structure to make it more functional. And so, you know, the finance and operations team reported into finance director, the HR team reported to the HR director, the marketing team reported to the CMO. And so we experimented. So it then meant more consistency, which allowed for more scalable business in those countries. And that's worked a lot better for us. But we had to go through the pain of doing that. So I think, you know, the biggest challenge in scaling has been that internationalization and underestimating the complexities and cost of going international, because having 1 country operation, very simple. Small, close-knit, you know what's going on. Going multi-country, suddenly huge amount of complexity. You're going to put more cost in place and more structure in place. Yeah, so don't underestimate the complexity. So only do this when you're absolutely ready to do it, because it's a big change and a big ask on particularly the founders and the rest of the team, and don't underestimate how distracting and complex that can be.
Right. So in that sense, do you sort of suggest that when founders start looking to scale their business, they should have a more conservative approach to it? Like, understand the market first, sort of develop a rough structure, and then you go into scaling.
Yeah, and also, be prepared. And I'm a strong believer in the founders playing a role in that internationalization process. So going on the ground, doing the business development, talking to the teams, living and breathing it a little bit, because that's when you start to identify, what the nuances of doing business in Malaysia are different from doing business in Indonesia versus Thailand versus Vietnam. You start to then identify what some of the opportunities are, and also what some of the challenges are internally and also externally. So I always encourage, if possible, for one of the founders to relocate if possible, or to make a significant commitment to spend a significant amount of their time in the new markets, to support the existing organization, and also to help get it up off the ground. It's a big commitment, so only do it when you're absolutely ready.
So I just want to bring in like Vidit's question now. So Vidit's asking, like, what's the right time for a startup to start expanding in another market, and how do you decide on the timing of expansion and prioritization between various Southeast Asian markets?
Okay, so let me answer. I'll answer the last question first. So what we did was we went out and did some primary and secondary research in all the markets south of China, and sort of east of India. So across most of Asia, looked at what, in our case, macroeconomic. We looked at population growth, which drives obviously property, how big the property market was, the structure of the property market. We looked at the structure of the media market for us, because obviously, if it's heavily traditional, then then we know what we need to focus on in terms of bringing the money off. If it's a very concentrated market, like for example Hong Kong, for the property market is very concentrated. You've got 2 agencies, you've got 3 or 4 developers. If you don't work with those 2 agencies and 3 or 4 developers, you're not going to build a sustainable business. In our case, that's why we decided not to go to Hong Kong, even though everyone said, oh, surely Hong Kong's similar to Singapore. It's completely and utterly different. And so we spent a little bit of time analyzing it. And whilst we were doing that, we spent time in some of these markets and visited these markets. We met some of the existing small players and some of the people in the ecosystem. And as a result of that, we then ended up doing some very small acquisitions, basically acqui-hires, to find some people on the ground to help to start to accelerate the business. That's kind of the research piece. In terms of when we were ready, it was around, we only did it after 4.5 years, when we built the profitable, strong Singapore business, and after discussions and dialogue with our investors. In hindsight, would I have gone 1 market to 4 markets in 4 months? Probably not. I would have probably taken a little bit more time. We were worried that if we don't act very quickly, we might lose the position. And of course, now we're in a nice position, but at the time it was tough. So, but yeah, so choosing the right time for us was when we had built this strong online presence, brand, profit, cash flow, and felt that the business was in a more stable position to be able to then start to build on that internationally.
So it's all about going back to like the foundations, ensuring that you have a strong foundation to build on, and you're addressing your sort of main pain point, like, really well before you move on.
It's similar a little bit to the point I made before around experimentation. Don't try and do too much at the same time. Obviously innovation and experimentation is important. Growing and scaling and learning is important, but don't get pushed into doing things too fast. Don't run before you can walk. Because otherwise, you risk blowing everything.
So I'm just gonna go on to the last question from Tin. So she's asking, what should be some expanded skill sets founders should have when they start scaling their businesses?
Yeah, very, very good question. I think I'm not sure if there's a right or wrong answer around this. I mean, for me, I think it's the same as for any founder building a business, right? bit of hunger, bit of passion, the core skills, resilience and tenacity, the things that drive you will enable you to scale. So had I grown a company, a digital company across Southeast Asia before? No. Had I done anything in property market before? No. I was very green to it. Had I had experience in terms of building and running teams before? Yes, but not in some of these countries. And so some of it you learn on the go. You can't over plan some of these things either. You can't have all the skill set. Some of it you learn, and you try to find people who can complement some of your skill sets. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this. I think that in our case it was the passion, the sheer resilience and brutality of the work rate that kind of helped us through that. And we partnered as well, So I think partnering was quite important for us in approaching it. So in Malaysia, for example, we had a great partner. So I think some of the core skills around, being a good people person, being open, being humble, and we'll see you through. But willingness to learn, willingness to fail, and not be too scared about that is obviously important. The core soft skills are obviously far more important, I think, than some of the harder skills, because it will see you through.
So I think it's really just going back to the idea of, like, you can just prepare the best you can, and then you just try your best and you hope for the best.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can probably study, internationalization strategies for 5 years, or you can go out there and start doing it, and learn. So we know that building a team in Malaysia is very different from building a team in Indonesia and Thailand. It's night and day difference. But I didn't know that beforehand. I've only learned that through 2 or 3 years later, after getting the battle scars. I think the only thing that you can perhaps do to mitigate this is to find advisors who can perhaps help, who have actually been through this before. I know mentors, for example. I was very fortunate, myself and my founder, very fortunate to have a mentor for about 18 months during some of the toughest times we were scaling. And we bounced challenges and ideas around with that mentor. We particularly struggled with accountability, for example. Was something that was neither in our DNA, was in neither my or my co-founder's DNA, and he coached us a lot around that. So maybe that's one way of complementing the lack of skill set, is finding people who've actually perhaps done something similar before.
I see. But anyway, thanks so much today I think we've roughly reached the end of the AMA.
Okay.
And thanks so much, Steve, for your time today and logging in to answer all these questions. I think it really helped provide a lot of value for our startups.
Thanks, Ivan. It was very, very broad and far-reaching, the questions. So I hope that was useful. And thanks for giving me the opportunity. And look forward to the next one.
Yeah, definitely. So for those who are watching, Steve and the other track champions will be returning in March for more AMAs, and we'll be giving top 100 applicants and current contestants priority for questions. So to look out for the EDMs that we'll be sending out, because we'll be giving you guys priority over those who leave your questions in the articles. And yeah, so I think we can wrap up the AMA. Thanks so much, Steve.
Great. Thanks, Ivan. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.
Okay.